My next guest also lives in California, but he was born far from there. In fact, to some, he would appear to be the perfect English gentleman, and that image was enhanced by his performance as John Steed in the television series of the 60s, The Avengers. Now comes his autobiography, titled, fetchingly, Blind in One Ear. Welcome to Patrick Macnee. Now, you were born, it seems to be, into just about the dottiest upper crust family imaginable, a cross between something created by Evelyn Waugh and something by Tom Sharp. Did you care to quote what your father was reported to have said on your birth?
No, I don't think you're allowed to do that on the radio. I think he used four-letter words, and they're usually ... I remember that was once used about me in a production of a play in Toronto in which the lady, Gina Mallet, said, take this load of ... back to the United Kingdom, where it belongs, which I thought was a lovely phrase. So I'm always very careful about it. But he was a very pithy little man, and he was called Shrimp Macnee. He was very small, and he started as a jockey. And he cared a great deal about horses and knew a great deal about their hocks, tendons, and almost everything to do with them, and remarkably little about human beings. And I think, yes, I descended upon him and was really quite an embarrassment.
And your mother's reaction to your decision to become an actor?
Well, she definitely was, is she a lady, my dear? And I always think that if one uses one's phrases like that, one actually isn't, and I don't know how you analyse these things. But I think she thought definitely, yes, that to be an actor was something that you didn't do.
And if you did, you didn't tell the servants about it?
No, you certainly didn't. The fact that we had servants at all is something I feel one shouldn't... I've never had a servant in my entire adult life, I hasten to add.
Now, your dad took himself off to India. In the meantime, your mother took herself a lesbian lover. Did they give you a hard time, your mother and her friend?
No, not remotely. My mother had and I think she was remarkably dexterous, really, because she lived with her lesbian lover, who was a remarkable woman anyway, and I'm deeply grateful to her because she educated me much better than I had any right to deserve. But my mother also visited at cocktail time the shortest racehorse trainer in Lambourne. It was my father, Shrimp Macnee. And then she went a little further down the road to Stork House to the tallest racehorse trainer in Lambourne. His name was Ozzie Bell, won the Derby twice, particularly with Felsted 28. From whose loins my brother came. Then she went back to her lesbian lover for dinner, and I think that's pretty good of an evening, taking me along with her in holiday time. I was very admiring.
But didn't your mother's friend insist that you wore a kilt at all times?
It didn't seem wrong to me at all. They were all wearing the equivalent of kilts, skirts. They didn't wear trousers in those days, you know. They're heavy, tweedy ladies who wore collars and ties. They looked remarkably like men. And, yes, she wanted me to wear a kilt, and I used to wait at table, and I was treated definitely as a second-class citizen. My son often says to me, Pa, you're treating me like a second-class citizen. I didn't quite know what one was, actually, particularly as I unfortunately educated him better than I was myself and sent him to Princeton, gives him the right to patronize me. But it didn't seem peculiar to me at all.
You were packed off to Eton, weren't you? Were you as miserable as most old Etonians seem to have been?
No, the opposite. I was miserable at Summerfield's Banbury Road, Oxford, which is 8 to 12. I was miserable between 5 and 8 when I went to two old dragons down in Minehead, Somerset, who beat the hell out of you. And I was away from my parents. I cried all the time. No, by the time I got to Eton, I was a young, extremely precocious gentleman. I ran a very thriving bookmaking business. I sold more dirty literature than you and I have had hot dinners. And I learnt an enormous amount about life, and I, in fact, matriculated very well, and was so bright that when I went into the Navy afterwards, I became a very... an extremely good navigator. So I was highly educated way before I had any right to be.
You almost broke William Hill, the bookist, didn't you?
Well, I was an early client, and at that time my father did give me tips straight from the horse's mouth. I made a great deal of money. Not as much as a friend of mine the other day who apparently made $45,000 before he was 11. But I did well.
That's good. When did the idea strike, then, about going on stage?
When I was 6.5. I played Henry V uncut at the age of 8, rather well. And we acted all the time. It was, I mean, as Glenda Jackson has said many times, you learn most out of failure and also by an unhappy home life. You cannot be an actor, I don't think, without an unhappy home life. I can't stand people with happy home lives.
All right, then we'll have a little musical punctuation. The Eagles, Take It Easy. And so we shall for this tiny break.
Dear Mum, these winter holidays are really the business. A short drive up the M11 to Stansted Airport, and bingo, you're thousands of miles away in the sun. But guess what? I got Majorca mixed up with Munich this time. I thought it rather odd no one else had skis at the check-in. Love, Arthur.
You know, there's something rather clever about taking a holiday in the middle of an English winter. And now Thompson Holidays have added Stansted to their winter programme. They're flying to 5 new exciting destinations, with thousands of holidays and lots of hotels and apartments to choose from. You couldn't wish for more. So forget Munich. Try the Algarve, Mallorca, Tenerife, Costa Blanca, Costa del Sol.
But don't take our word for it. Fly it for yourself. Contact your travel agent for a Thompson's Winter Sun brochure and Stansted flight guide.
The AM programme on LBC Radio is known to be the best alarm clock in London. As you struggle to shrug off the duvet, we bring you news of London, the nation and the world, and keep you in touch with the time.
Speaking of alarm clocks, if you know anyone who's missing out on the AM programme, it's high time you told them. AM, each weekday morning between 6 and 10 with Douglas Cameron and Peter Diddy.
My guest is Patrick Macnee. You got to the West End before World War II, didn't you?
No, not quite. I think it was about 41 I was in a play at the Comedy. And then I understudied in Vivian Lee's Doctor's Dilemma. I've been reading a lot about the Olivier's, of course, lately, as we all have. And she was just the most beautiful woman. I was understudied then, general understudied with Peter Jones. But I was in the West End a lot at the very beginning of the war, because most other people were called up. And then I went into the war, and then I wasn't in the West End for years, 34. I was in about 3 years ago when I last saw you, in a terrible flop at the Savoy. So my record in the West End has been spotty, to say the least.
Olivier, in fact, rejected you, didn't he?
Yeah, well, a great friend of mine was Michael Waugh, who's at Eton with me, and Olivier brought him down. I remember the first night at the New there, after Henry IV Part 1, and he brought Michael down and said, this is the new me, sort of thing. And Michael introduced me to him, and Olivier in those days was an extremely haughty man, and the height of it, and why the hell should he be interested in somebody like me at that time? On the other hand, Gielgud, you see, used to give you a tremendous amount of time and would help. It's very interesting the way one remembers those people, isn't it?
Yes.
Guinness. One remembers dear, sweet, wonderful people. One remembers autocratic people. One remembers drunken people. One remembers homosexual people. One remembers tyrants. And I remember them all very vividly. I have a sort of embarrassing recall.
Olivier did later congratulate you on your television success there.
He suddenly appeared. There was a tiny little barber shop just down the road here on Duke Street, and there were 2 seats. And he'd been very ill, and suddenly this businessman, I didn't even recognize him, this great, beautiful man, he looked at me and said, McGee, your show's awfully good. And do you know, I didn't recognize him. He said, my name is Laurence Olivier. Now, I know he said Olivia. He's called Olivier, isn't he?
Did he call you McGee?
Yeah, he said McGee. So then he got home, and there was a call about I must have been there another 20 minutes. And he rang up, and he spoke to the barber, Mr. Jones, his name was a famous barber, and said, look, will you please apologise to Mr. Macnee? I mean, I know he was Mr. Macnee, and he did that, but I called him McGee, and my wife said, you can't do that. That's the only time I've ever met him, this dear, great, wonderful man.
You were related to David Niven, aren't you?
Well, only by what you might call extracurricular activity on my mother's part, because she was madly in love with his elder brother, Max, who was considerably older than him. And I think, you know, when the child grows up and begins to be an embarrassment, you sort of say to the child, this is your cousin, and he happened to be David Niven's elder brother. It wasn't until David was 70 and we were working in Goa on the Sea Wolves, and he said, honestly, I'm not your cousin, and told me that. But we then became enormously dear friends, and I miss him. Everybody who knew him misses him, because suddenly when people like that go, you don't believe it, do you? They're so lovely.
You went off to Canada to do what?
Well, I literally went off because I had £12 in my pocket, and I was at Windsor Rep, and the kids were growing up, and somebody, David Green, who's since won about 6 Emmys, he won one just the other day with Kirk Douglas and Jason Roberts and Hair at the Wind. And he said, if you can be overnight, you've got a part. And we earned $100 a week, which was a fortune in Toronto. And there were very few people. It was the start of television. It was a wonderful sort of sense of discovery. And entirely through that, there was a man who was ahead of it. I got the Avengers, because I came back, it's a bit like Pierce Brosnan, suddenly Remington Steele. I said, where's he come from? And, of course, I'd been away from England 9 years, and I suddenly was in the Avengers because of this wonderful Canadian man, not through England at all.
The Avengers wasn't called that originally, was it?
It's called Police Surgeon with Ian Hendry, one of the greatest actors ever lived.
How much of a hand did you have in developing the dandified character of John Steed?
Well, I had a lot in developing John Steed because all he gave us was the character. And I think one must have had instinct, you know. I think when you've had the amount of experience I've had and you've had, particularly in live television, you have a very quick instinct. Then you've had a whole of a Second World War, and you've seen death, you've seen this, you've seen the other, you've seen fast-changing things. I think you're able to latch on to something, and I realised this was my big chance. And I latched on to a representative, which was Scarlett Pimpernel, of looking tremendously cool outwardly and underneath being as hard as steel. And I remember being like that in the war. I always think Englishmen are like that, don't you? I mean, they'll always say, I'm terribly sorry, then they'll hit you in the guts very hard. And an Englishman is always completely the opposite to what he appears to be. And I like to do that. That's why I called it the Upside Down Show. I used a more basic word. But I've always seen life on a tilt. Nothing is ever straight to me.
I'm not surprised. The Pretenders now, if there was a man. The Pretenders, if there was a man. And, Patrick, I didn't know there was a connection between you and the Pretenders.
Well, I did a production of Sleuth by Tony Shaffer last year, and a wonderful young Canadian actor, Geraint Wyn-Davies, said to me, I saw you last year on The Pretenders. And as we hadn't met, I thought he meant the Avengers, obviously,
Yeah.
you know, which was a quarter of a century ago. I said, and of course it was. Chrissie Hynde was a great admirer of Di Rigg, and she did, Don't Get Me Wrong, wasn't that a hit number? And she wanted, apparently Steed was her sort of pin-up, presumably when she was a tiny tot. So they got 2 clips of me from the Avengers, and I was famous the year before last for this, The Pretenders. But this year, I'm Swiss Chalet chain of restaurants of fast foods in Canada at the moment. Saw you on Swiss Chalet, which I may tell you was a very difficult thing to say over a 2-hour period. And I had to say 3:25, the dinner. Then I came back, because I was so successful, 5:25. 2 hours into the commercial, they rushed down from upstairs and said, no, it's 6:75 now. That's the quickest inflation I've ever found. And the reason is, of course, because there's terrible drought in Canada and the United States. So these chickens have gone up in price. But that was so funny. But I'm known for that.
The show is still shown around the world in a
Everywhere.
bona fide way. Does it bring you any money?
Yes.
Oh, good.
And it will bring me more. It's owned by... If they bring it out on cassette, they're all pirated now, which infuriates me. People say, oh, we got a cassette of your show. And it's pirated, you know, to take them off the thing. They're not done. They're all at Elstree Studios now, you know, it's going to be sold. In a room there, in great big tins, about 86 of them, and I am lobbying, which is my favourite word, to get those tins into cassettes in prime condition and shown like Star Trek is.
And, of course, it will work. Now, you're in California. How long have you been there, and what work have you been doing?
Oh, gee willikers. Well, I was working just the other day. My latest movie is called The Lobster Man from Mars. Before that, The Big Chill. I do a lot of what they call non-union films. The most famous non-union film I did was The Howling, which is one of the most successful horror films ever made, followed by This Is Spinal Tap, get that for a title, by Rob Reiner, which is a highly successful film, all of which you get paid nothing for, and they make millions. I do hundreds of these films because I like to work. The more that nearly I get to old age pension, which I now have from the Screen Actors Guild, and very healthy, I may say,
Are you
the more I work.
Are you the eponymous hero of the Lobster Man from Mars?
I'm not the Lobster Man, but I am the professor who discovers him. It's really a very funny film. It's taken quite seriously, because I believe that on Mars you could, if you were a crustacean, exist, overlooking the fact, of course, you need water as well as air.
Is this what you mean by saying, as I have read, that you lead an eccentric existence?
Well, I always wonder what eccentric means, you know, because my daughter has now got, and I'm a grandfather, thank goodness, and she's got a lovely husband. He was married before, and apparently the first wife looks on her as a real dropout, you know. And she said, Pa, what they don't realise is that you're the real mad person. I feel of myself as completely sane. I think it's other people's observation of one, don't you?
Quite.
I'm an iconoclast, which I prefer.
Well, anyone who reads your book will probably have some sympathy with the other point of view, but it'd be amazed that you're not so eccentric. Because you were a bit late for the Hollywood Raj, weren't you, under Sir C. Aubrey Smith and the cricket team?
Oh, way late for that, yes.
Well, that would have suited you, do you feel?
No, I would have hated it. I hate those old devils. No, and I knew them all, Bob Coote and Rex Harrison, and all of them. I think they're great men, wonderful actors, but I would hate to have been part of a group. I hate cricket, anyway. I loathe cricket.
Do you want to do classical theatre again? Have you
Not remotely. I can't even say one. I've just had to do a television show in Canada in which I had to recite some of Othello. Thank God my leading man was a parrot. And most of Henry V and quite a lot of Hamlet. And I find it very difficult to string those thingamabobs together. I can only say about 2 lines in succession.
So you're flying about the place, publicising your book. What will the next job be?
Well, my next immediate job, believe it or not, and that's what I love, is the mad irony of this ridiculous place. But my next thing is Where There's a Will, which is a television series done in Plymouth last year, a pilot, and Warner Brothers have bought it, and we're doing it in Hollywood. You won't believe it. I'm the Englishman abroad. They said, you're typified the typical Englishman, but I'm going to be a Harold Wilson, Margaret Thatcher Englishman. I'm not going to be no old Winston Churchill, the British Empire. I don't represent that. That's Wilfrid Hyde-White, in my opinion.
I've enjoyed talking to you very much indeed, and I will remind our listeners of your autobiography. It's called Blind in One Ear, published by Harrop on the 29th of September, £12.95. Patrick Macnee, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, very much.